Welcome to the Game Changers podcast, where you'll hear from trailblazing women in sport. I'm Sue Anstiss, a founding trustee of the Women's Sport Trust charity and CEO of Promote PR, one of the UK's leading sports communications agencies. This third series of the Game Changers is supported by Barclays and will focus on fearless women in football, reinforcing Barclays' huge commitment to the beautiful game. Last year, Barclays announced the biggest ever sponsorship of women's sport in the UK, as the Barclays FA Women's Super League became Europe's first fully professional women's football league. And along with this brilliant support for women's professional sport, Barclays also invested in establishing the Girls Football School Partnerships, with the aim of ensuring that all girls in England have equal access to football in schools by 2024. Today's guest knows all about the amazing support of Barclays, as she's helping to deliver and transform the women's professional football in England as the director of the women's professional game at the FA. Kelly Simmons MBE now oversees the FA Women's Super League, the FA Women's Championship, the FA Women's National League and the Women's Pyramid of Football. Kelly's been an extraordinary trailblazer for the women's game, having spent over 20 years at the Football Association. She was previously the FA Director of Participation and Development, overseeing the implementation of a £200 million 4-year investment programme into children's and grassroots football. In recognition of all of Kelly's incredible work, in 2002, she was awarded an MBE for services to football. And in 2006, she received the BT Sports Industries Award for leadership in sport. Kelly played football at university, so I started by asking her if she'd ever played before that.
No, I wasn't allowed to play, so at school we had to play netball, hockey, sort of more traditional female sports. I think that's one of the things that really drives me to make sure this generation have got more opportunities, because I was so passionate about football and I found it really frustrating that my brother went off to play the sports that I saw on television and were really interested in, like football, rugby and cricket. And then I got sent off to play the sports that didn't have any visibility. And then I didn't feel as passionate about. So university, first thing I did was sign up for the women's football team, and then went on to get my coaching qualifications. But yeah, it's definitely a driver, I think, for why I'm so determined to make sure this generation have got better chances.
Were you a footballing family? So were you fans of football within the family?
Yeah, very much so. My mum always says if we didn't have football to talk about, she's not sure what the family would talk about when they sat down to Sunday lunch. So my dad was an Arsenal fan, mum a big Liverpool fan, and some of the family are Luton Town season ticket holders. So it's quite a mix. Yeah. And it makes it interesting sometimes if our teams are playing each other. But yeah, very, very passionate. Yeah.
And are you allowed an allegiance yourself to follow a team now?
Well, yeah, I do. I think it's well known that I'm a big Liverpool fan. But honestly, in the women's game, and I can say this hand on heart, I don't have a team, because I think I just so desperately want the Women's Super League to do well. Yeah. And all I really care about is, is the game high quality? Is it competitive? Is there a good attendance? It's all the sorts of things that, you're thinking about when you're in that sort of leadership role. So it doesn't sort of worry me who wins the Super League. All I'm worried about really is making sure that it's a really good battle to the finish.
And how did you come to be at the FM? You've been there for over 2 decades now, so such a long time. And I've heard you say in the past that you almost sort of found the FA by accident. What was the process from university to ending up at the FA?
Well, I was due to go on and do a master's at Warwick University, and I took a year out as a sabbatical to be sports officer and got involved in organising sports, did my coaching qualifications, did my football badges, and started to get involved in sports development and loved it. So I decided actually that was the sort of route I wanted to go down. Didn't realise I could work in football. Went to Manchester University, started doing a similar type of role full time, developing sport and organising sports activities. And the FA rang and they said that they're creating 3 regional posts to start to develop the game, even though the women's football didn't come under the FA then. It was a separate women's FA, but they're starting to look at the development of it. And I was one of the few coaches, female coaches, and had got a sort of a role already in developing sport. So they approached me, and I said to my dad, the FA have rang me up, want me to come for a job. He so desperately wanted to go to Lancaster Gate where we were. Then he was like, "You're going, I'm taking you." So he came with me on the train, and off we went. And he sat in a cafe around the corner. I came out and said, "Dad, they've offered me the job. I hope you've taken it." So that was the start of it. Yeah, it was. I've never planned. When I go to these. Talk to students and they ask about your career plan. I think, I just, lucked it. Yeah, it was just a fluke. Yeah.
And did you bite the hand off at the time, or did you think twice about it? What was your sort of perception of the FA from the outside at that time?
I don't know if I knew that much about them, really. I don't think I'd really thought about it. I just thought this is a fantastic opportunity to go in and work in football and get involved in the development of the game. Quite quickly afterwards I became sort of the lead for women's football, and it was a fantastic time. So we appointed Hope Powell as first national coach. We put the England youth teams in, we put the girls' centres of excellence in the professional clubs. It was a blank canvas. I remember the first count we did on girls' football teams, and it was 80. And I think, we're well on track now to announce the doubling of participation, which will be the equivalent of 12,000 club-based teams. So you really did have a blank piece of paper to put the whole player pathway in, which of course was really, really exciting time for the game.
And you mentioned that you've got your coaching badges at university. So was coaching ever an option for you, a Hope Powell type role, or was that ever tempt you?
Well, I can't play as well as Hope. I'm not sure about the credibility. I mean, I loved coaching, but predominantly when I came in, we did quite a lot of coaching coaches and encouraging female coaches to come through and coaching teachers so that we could get girls' football set up in schools and clubs. And I really, really enjoyed that. But once I got promoted into a national post, I realised that the bag of footballs had to come out the back of the boot and the tracksuits, because there's so much to do in terms of the development and talent developments or structures in the game. So then it became much more about strategy and budgets and stakeholders and all of those things, and I had to give up the coaching, but I did love it.
And you talk now in terms of a bit of a shortage of female coaches coming through, with the fantastic fact that we're getting so many women and girls playing, but that shortage of women's coaches, and I guess the work you're doing now in schools, it's almost gone full circle 2 decades on. So what are you doing now to get more female coaches into the sport?
Well, my role is obviously is the women's professional game, so we've had quite a big shift actually. And if you look at the Women's Super League now, that around half of them are female coaches. It wasn't that long ago. I think Emma Hayes was about the only female coach. So certainly we're seeing a shift, which is great. We appointed a head of women's coach education, Audrey Cooper, who's doing a fantastic job identifying and developing a pipeline of top female coaches to come through, whether that's working with the England youth teams, working in the Super League and the Championship and across the Women's National League. And there's a lot of talented female coaches. I think the challenge, the sort of more of a challenge really, is lower down the game, where the game is growing so quickly. I think it's been well documented that, so if you take after the Women's World Cup, over nearly 800,000 more people, women and girls, started playing football. It's some huge growth figures, and so the challenge is to keep up with that and get women and men coaching football. But certainly I think when we do announce the figures of growth, we'll see that we've obviously got a lot more coaches involved, because there's a lot more girls teams and a lot of Wildcats, over 1,000 Wildcats centres across the country with great coaches in that are qualified to work in that age group, and coaches taking on girls teams all the time. But of course there's more to do.
That's fantastic. I didn't know when you said about that kind of numbers of female coaches within the WSL. That is amazing that's happened. And has that been you personally, but the FA driving that as well as the clubs? Where are those opportunities come from?
Yeah, it's both, I think. So if you take someone like Casey would have been, obviously there's an inner drive from Casey to be a top manager. And, so she, coming to the end of her career, was identified as somebody to go on the A licence. So there's been a sort of scheme for a while to identify players who are sort of coming to the end of their playing career that want to go into coaching and managing. And we've seen, increasing numbers coming through that route. Obviously, we work with the PFA as well that fund courses for players coming to support them in terms of post-career. So it's very much a partnership with the FA, the clubs and the PFA. But I think we've also been identifying coaches to work with the England women's youth teams to get really good experience as well for some time now, and I think that's paid dividends as well. So when you look across the Women's Super League, there's some fantastic female coaches in there.
It's a very exciting time, isn't it? And I guess when you joined the FA, I think you yourself said there was no real visibility of women's football or women in football. So did it feel like an extraordinary hill to climb at the time, or was it just exciting to have that blank canvas and opportunity?
I think sometimes you could think about the scale of the task, and the task for me is equality in every way, not just in football, in life. So when you think about it in that context, certainly going back in time, the task felt enormous, the cultural barriers huge, the blockers to girls being able to play football or being bullied because they want to play football, and all those cultural barriers were so strong, and you know, we've been breaking them down, smashing them down one by one. But yeah, sometimes it's felt like an enormous task, but it's also felt really, really exciting because, you know, as I said, there wasn't a lot in place, so everything you did tended to be, you know, significant growth.
You've obviously had this amazing career progression through the organisation. So head of football development, as you say, coming in regionally, and then head of national game, director of development, and now director of the women's professional game. I've almost answered my own question there, but what's kept you at the FA for so long? Because you have been there, you know, people have come and gone, and you've been there a very long time. Well,
it's a fantastic place to work. I think people have a perception outside of the FA that probably isn't how it is internally. I've always worked, you know, with a sort of diverse, passionate, energetic group of people who are hugely committed to developing the game of football in this country for men and women, and so it's been a fantastic place to work. I think the fact that I've been able to change roles and grow has been a big driver on me wanting to stay. And I guess the great thing about development is the work will never be done. You know, there's always more coaches to qualify, more referees to qualify. Obviously, we've got a huge challenge, which I'm sure we'll talk about building a professional women's game. You know, I loved working as director of development because when I came into that role, really, we're going back a while, the County Football Associations really only did governance of the game. It was sort of red, yellow cards, sanctioning leagues. We put the development staff in. Football Foundation was starting at that time. The football industry was changing massively, so you know, millions were starting to go into the development of the game, which had never been seen before, and in facilities and development. You know, we did a lot around building big community clubs, qualified coaches. When we did a first count of qualified coaches in children's football, it was 2%. It's over 90% now. There's nearly 60,000 youth teams out there, so the scale of every time you want to do something in football, the scale is huge. And probably one of the things that I'm most proud of, which was a real team effort, was changing the way children play football. So I can remember, I'm sort of old enough to remember parents marching outside Lancaster Gate that you've denied our children's rights at the age of 6 to play 11-a-side football on a huge muddy pitch and touch the ball 3 times. And you know, we spent a lot of time researching world's best practice around what children should play. So we implemented 5v5, 7v7, 9v9. I think you see now that, you know, the technical improvement in young players who've come through that system.
I know, so lots of female sports look at you in admiration of all you've done and you're doing across football. Would you ever consider looking at other sports? Are you approached by other sports to go and work elsewhere? Yeah, I have been approached by other sports, but my passion is, and I won't say, you know, never say never, of course. Yeah, I love a lot of other sports, but my absolute passion is football. It is our nation's game, and this will sound a bit twee, but I absolutely believe in the power of football. And I think, I do think, you know, I said this, I went on record as saying this when I took the director of the women's professional game, that the Women's Super League can be the breakthrough sport. And what I mean by that for women, and what I mean by that is that I think that we've cracked pinnacle events in women's sport, Olympics, World Cups, whatever the sport, big moments, big audiences, big profile. But what we haven't cracked, or we're starting to crack, I think, with Women's Super League, is that regular coverage, so the sport doesn't disappear until the next 2-year or 4-year big major event, that real kind of breakthrough mainstream, and I think we can really do that. Now I think that is hugely powerful for women and girls in society that's bigger than football. And when you've cracked that, might we see you as the first female CEO at the FA, not putting anyone out of a role, but what are your aspirations for the future? Do you know, I'm not putting Mark there. He's doing a good job. Yeah, he's doing a great job, and he's only just in it as well. Yeah, no, I'm really happy, thrilled to be doing this job. I came in 16 months ago. We're on a big change program, a big growth
And I think it's hugely exciting. I'm just desperate to see that through, really. We've got some big ambitions with the clubs about what we think we can achieve with the Women's Super League and the Women's Championship, and really build professional women's football. And I'm convinced that we can make it sustainable over the next 5-7 years. And that would be something I don't think any women's team sport, maybe outside of basketball in America, has achieved, and that would be phenomenal.
So exciting, isn't it? And last year it did feel like there wasn't a week that went by when you weren't announcing another commercial partnership. So Boots and Lucozade and Head and Shoulders, and then of course the biggest sponsorship in UK women's sport at Barclays. Why do you feel you've been so successful at attracting those commercial partners as a women's sport?
I think a range of reasons. I think if you look at society, and I think there's a greater challenge on everybody, including brands, to be inclusive and diverse and support women. So I guess that whole sort of movement has helped change the environment. I think you've seen a change in sponsorship and sports sponsorship, with brands wanting to demonstrate, a better purpose, a wider purpose, and wanting to put back into society, and want to, particularly in the context of Barclays, really keen as well to be seen internally as an inclusive and diverse employee, and so therefore reviewing their sponsorship portfolio, and having been a big supporter and investor in the Men's Premier League, I think it made absolute sense as part of that portfolio to support the top of the women's game too. So I think there's been changes in society, changes in sports sponsorship, changes in what brands want out of it, and of course the growth of the women's game. You can't hide away from the fact that 25 million people watched the Women's World Cup, 11 million people watched the semi-final. I think we were picked on, I can't remember if it was average or peak, we beat them on one. The latter was it, the rugby World Cup final, and then of course Gavin and Stacey I think smashed everybody out the park.
I think that's fair enough though, isn't it? We give it to Gavin and Stacey,
but those numbers were absolutely huge, and that tells a story of interest, and our research and insight backs up this huge interest and engagement in the women's game.
And is there a way you're packaging and selling? Because I guess for all sports, but for many sports, the societal changes, what brands are looking for, but people are coming to football, and I guess it's that internally the team, the way in which you've packaged and approached people.
I think so if we take Barclays, I'm sure they won't mind saying, who are an incredible partner for us, we very much listened to and developed a structure and a package that worked for them and us. So originally when they came in, it was around title sponsorship of the Women's Super League, obviously, which they are, but they're also really keen to invest back into community. So they are a big supporter and investor in our ambition that every girl has a chance to play football in school. So not just about delivering professional women's football now, but inspiring and supporting the next generation of girls to go on and be professional women's footballers. So that was about really sort of building that together and listening to brands and understanding what they want. But increasingly I think we're seeing two things when we talk to brands. One, that they don't want to be seen and don't want to be in men's only space, and secondly they often want some community activation and engagement as well. I think they've been the two shifts really, as opposed to sort of badging and eyeballs. It's very much changed.
Excellent. And you've got that in spades to offer in terms of development. The opening games of this season, FA-WSL obviously smashed all records. I think average attendances were around 10,000 versus 900 or so in 2018. And then that extraordinary night at Wembley with 80,000 coming out to watch the Lionesses play Germany. So how have the attendances been across the league since then?
So we're 250% up, and we're absolutely thrilled. And I think why is that? I think there's no doubt we've worked really hard to make sure that we pulled through some of that interest and engagement in the Women's World Cup. We really focus on the calendar, and when but she's obviously challenging because there's so much men's football and sometimes you can't avoid it. But we've really focused on putting our biggest games in the best slots, focusing on the FIFA men's windows when there's no Premier League, working with the clubs to put big games in men's stadiums. Seen some phenomenal attendances. I think I'll never forget going to Tottenham Arsenal and I think it was about 28,000, and you could hear the atmosphere. You got the Arsenal fans chanting down one end and the Spurs fans singing at the other end, and it looked incredible, and that is what we can deliver, and we've done it at Stamford Bridge and the Etihad and across grounds, so we've really amplified those big games and invested in what we call big games bigger, and trying to keep up profile, build attendances, keep up profile. We had a big women's football weekend where we smashed all records again. That was deliberately put when there was no men's football on, so lots of sort of tactics, I suppose, to really help drive attendances. And obviously we've got to keep going. I think one of the really pleasing things is because people say to me, the attendances are only up in the men's stadiums. Like, I don't know why that doesn't count. I'm like, well, they're still still watching. Yeah. Is that we're starting to see some of the big games in the women's stadiums sell out. So Arsenal, Chelsea particularly have started to sell out some of their bigger games, which gives us new and interesting challenges, which is great and a great problem to have. But I think that's been really pleasing as well.
I can move on to some of those challenges. I guess all that fantastic success, but a lot of discussion this season around the quality of pitches for the WSL games, and obviously quite a lot of cancelled fixtures. And then you've got the likes of Lewis FC with a supported campaign calling for equal prize money and the FA Cup for men and women. So I wonder whether these high-profile issues sort of frustrate you, because you know how much is being done behind the scenes to progress the women's game, but they sometimes kind of make a lot of noise.
Yeah, of course it was frustrating. We were on an incredible run at the time. We, attendances were up and are up hugely. Our audiences are up massively, sort of around 38% in terms of live games on television. So every indicator was up, and, we were on a fantastic roll. And of course we had three storms, I think it was, the 3 weekends. We had well-documented problems with one or two pitches. I felt at times some of it was a little unfair, if I'm honest. But, I probably would, because the women, most of the women obviously haven't got their own ground, and they are in a partnership with either an EFL men's team like Tranmere with Liverpool, or National League team. And actually, a lot of those in the men's game were hit too, but there seemed to be a focus on the women's. Now, obviously, we are doing everything we can to fix that. Liverpool have moved ground. We are constantly working with clubs. Everton have moved back into the city, which will really help their attendances. So we're in a development phase. Not everything is fixed. Not everything is perfect. I think sometimes we get compared to the Men's Premier League, which is a multi-billion industry and has been going for a long time. So sometimes those comparisons can always knock the women's game, which sometimes feels a bit unfair, because you're trying to build a brand new professional sport and put it in the mainstream and build audiences and build attendances, and then something happens and then it gets benchmarks against the Men's Premier League, who's got, I think, was it 4 billion of TV rights or something. So it's not going to be the same. But that said, we've got to keep working at it. So we're constantly working with our partners and the clubs around how we improve, whether it's broadcast facilities, the pitches, or whether it's finding a better venue for the women's club. It's no doubt though, it's a challenge, but I think we've had unprecedented rain, unprecedented storms, but we've got to think that might be the new norm. So we've got to invest, and we know there's some grounds that have hardly been hit. So if you take Arsenal's ground at Boreham Wood, where they've got what we'd call in the trade a sort of a Desso pitch, I don't think they've lost anything. They might have lost one fixture. So we know what we've got to do, and we're working with the clubs to work through it.
And is moving back to summer schedule for WSL summer something that's ever considered, especially with the weather as it is?
No, definitely not, because it doesn't work. We've been there.
Tried it.
Yeah. Actually, when you take out the fact, because we share grounds with the men's pyramid, when you take out the fact that we used to have to break for pitch reseeding in May, and then we pretty much 3 years out of 4 we have to break in June, July for major tournaments, you actually ended up, there were very few weekends that were actually different. That's, I don't think, what people realise. But it was just that you were playing your first block sort of March, April, May time, and then you're playing the second block after the summer. And now obviously it's kind of reverse. It didn't save you a lot of weekends in that sense. So basically it just doesn't work for the women's calendar. Women's football in Europe and the world is built around a winter season. And so Champions League, for example, the clubs were really frustrated with summer season because you came back into the latter stages just as you're starting the season. You're in the quarterfinal of the Champions League. So, and the clubs rightly have got big aspirations. Champions League is only going to grow in importance in women's football. They're changing the tournament in a couple of years to go group stages, centralising the rights. It's going to be a very big part of the club calendar. Summer football doesn't really work for that. So I think, and the other thing as well is that the FA were criticised at the time with the Women's Super League because it was a closed league at the time because it was in the summer, and we always said once we've built it we would link it to the pyramid, and we, I passionately believe in the pyramid of football and promotion and relegation, and all of the rest of that pyramid plays in the winter season. So it's not so easy just to separate it out.
And you mentioned there in terms of the amazing funding, in terms of the men's game for the rights, and obviously some big announcements this week around the selling of rights in the future for the WSL next season. So can you tell us a little bit more about what we've heard at the moment in terms of those plans and so on? Yeah,
of course. So our domestic rights deal is up in 2021. Currently our deal is with BT Sport. So for me, that is one of the biggest opportunities and exciting opportunities that we have got. If we think about the new strategy for the professional game that we've built with the clubs, it's very much, it's about sort of the world-class product around developing and attracting the world's best players to play in the league. It's about building audiences and it's about building revenue for sustainability. When in terms of the latter two of those, this is the biggest thing we're going to do. So we have hired in a women's sports group and a guy called David Cogan who advised on the Premier League deals, rugby deals, multi-million deals, to help us to make sure that we get the best packages and deals to drive audience and revenue. And we expect it to be really, really competitive, and we're starting to have those discussions now with the broadcasters, and there's a lot of interest, so it's really exciting.
And a challenge obviously to get the balance right between that free to air to drive and increase your fan base, and then something behind the paywall obviously to generate that income for the sport too. So that's always, I guess, is a bit of a challenge moving forward.
Yeah, and that's part of the skill, I suppose, of how we package the rights so that we try and drive both. We're really clear as a board, the Women's Super League and Championship Board, who are a phenomenal board that we've put in place with the clubs, FA and independent people, some hugely respected people. We're really clear the audience is critical because we're in a growth stage of the sport. But so is revenue. So, we've got, we want the women's game to not be reliant on club owners and changes in circumstances in the men's game that might reduce funding or pull funding, as we've seen historically with women's football. We want it to be able to generate enough revenue to wash its face as professional football. So the revenue is really important, but it wouldn't all be about revenue. It's got to be a balance of audience and revenue. And I think what's also really exciting this year is that we've sold overseas rights, 11 territories announced so far, new sort of 7-figure monies coming into the game, and we're shortly due to announce a big deal in one of the big territories. Again, significant new money coming into the women's game, and we're selling across the world. So Super League's going global.
Very exciting. And there's talk sometimes, I guess, whether you ever consider an external body like Premier League or the EFL coming in and running the WSL in the future. Is that something you openly discuss and consider, or are you?
Yeah. No, absolutely. In fact, we've had those discussions quite recently. So we've talked to the Premier League for a little while now. I think the FA's position is that we don't, certainly in the men's game, we haven't run leagues. Obviously, we run tiers 1 to 4 in the women's game, but we don't run professional men's leagues, and that our job is sort of a developer. And so we're in this development stage of the leagues, but we're open to them being run externally moving forward. Premier League being sort of an obvious potential place for that. Premier League shareholders met quite recently. We had some discussions before that. I think there's still a lot of development work to do with the Super League Championship, and they felt that in the next rights cycle, because they work in domestic rights cycles, that they wouldn't offer to run it, but that the door certainly wasn't closed, and that over the next 12 months or so they would come back to consider what the future looks like, sort of, I guess, 2024, 2023, 2024 onwards. I think for the Women's Super League and Championship Board, and we've got this chat, that there's a number of options. So it could stay at the FA, it could go to somewhere like the Premier League, it could stand alone, it could have potentially could have a private equity model, a bit like Premier Rugby, and there's certainly been some interest around private equity investment into the Women's Super League. So I think there's all sorts of different models to explore about how the Women's Super League and Championship best thrives going forward. So I don't think it's just as clean as FA or Premier League. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting one for the board and the clubs to work through about what is the best. But certainly, the Premier League would be a fantastic home, of course, for the Women's Super League, because it's geared up to run a professional league. And it's got laser focus on that, so I think we're open-minded.
It's incredibly exciting times ahead there. I just wanted to move on one of the previous series. I spoke to Annie Aluko and interviewed her, and obviously her historically calling out racism within the FA and all that followed there. I guess, do you feel that lessons have been learned and things have changed since that time in terms of the FA?
Yeah, definitely, I think so. I mean, I'm not involved directly in the England setup, but I think it's, of course, an organisation, when they go through something as difficult as that, there has to be some soul searching. And I think, definitely we've seen a new inclusion strategy coming out, a real commitment to make sure that the culture at St George's Park, the diversity of the coaching and the workforce there, and all the other sort of components and commitments are there to make sure that that it's a really positive environment for anybody coming in. So I think, definitely lessons have been learned. I think, I've got the utmost respect for Annie. I think she's fantastic, and I was absolutely thrilled to see that she's coming out of the game, she's staying in coming out of playing the game, she's staying in the game. In fact, we were chatting a few weeks ago. She's a brilliant appointment for Aston Villa as sporting director, and that club have got big ambitions in the women's game. And I think it's fantastic that that she's she's obviously she's brave, and she's passionate about the game and passionate about equality, and will add massive value to the women's game. So I'm absolutely thrilled she's staying in, and she's involved in the Super League and Championship.
Fantastic. And you must have been so proud last summer, as it is now, the Lionesses' amazing performance at the FIFA World Cup. How did it feel for you being there and watching that after all the groundwork over those sort of 2 decades to reach that pinnacle?
Yeah, a real mixture, if I'm honest, a real mixture. So there's part of me that, you sort of have to pinch yourself, because you can see the audience figures coming in. The BBC were ringing and saying these figures are incredible, Kelly. It's not just the England games, it's every game. It was building and building. The momentum here and the coverage and the numbers were phenomenal. So that was hugely exciting. Of course, when you're at the games, you're a bag of nerves. And like, everybody in the England setup, we were desperate to try and beat the US, and we will one day. It was a disappointing end, I suppose. It's fantastic to get to semi-final. Football is a global game, and you've got to beat everybody in the world. It's not like sort of the sports where a few countries play it. You genuinely have to beat everyone, and it's really hard. In America, we've got 9 million players, and a culture where it's been a girls' sport for years. It's going to be tough to come out top. Of course, we hoped we could. We thought we could. We didn't quite get there. So I guess a mix of feelings, but when you then step away from that and the sort of the disappointment of going out the tournament, you have to step back and think, wow, that was a watershed moment in women's sport and women's football, for sure. That
was my next question, actually. We talk a lot, don't we, about tipping points, and I was going to ask you whether you feel that it was. How do you feel that impacts then filter down to the women's games? We come back off of that from the summer. Can you see that impact?
Yeah, well, it was definitely a tipping point. There's no doubt about that. You can see from the data, and we've got a lot of research and insight that underpins what we're doing. And so we were tracking during the Women's World Cup people's interest in women's football, how engaged they were, whether they were prepared to watch more women's football, whether they knew the household, the women as household names. The indicators, our insight team said to me, they've barely seen such shifts in data in a short time. So we know that it had a big impact on people's desire to follow women's football. So it changed what people thought of the product, because they saw a world-class product delivered brilliantly by the BBC, and they started to identify who the household names, which are really key in terms of maintaining interest in that, following through into the clubs as well. It changed people's sort of perceptions and interest and engagement levels. So it had a massive impact, and we've seen that. I think we wouldn't have seen some of the numbers we've seen with the Women's Super League had we not taken women's football to such big audiences.
And we've obviously seen the growing power of athlete activists like Megan Rapinoe in the States, and the others in their team too. And as someone working within an organisation, what are your thoughts on players sort of calling out injustices and so on within society or within their sports?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think the athletes, have got a powerful platform, and I think it's important that they use it. And obviously we're all watching at the moment what's happening with US soccer and the fight for equality there. So sometimes when the athletes stand up, that becomes a really powerful voice for change. That sometimes sometimes people are fighting internally, sometimes the media or other people are fighting externally. There's lots of voices, but I think when you have world-class athletes stand up, it really does get a sort of cut through that others can't get. And you've seen that with Megan in the US squad, globally famous, taking on Trump and all sorts. But, a really powerful voice. And I think, we're both involved, obviously, with the Women's Sport Trust and the Unlock campaign about helping athletes to find their voice and use that voice, use that platform to champion their causes. And I think that's a wonderful and powerful thing.
Fantastic. So just finishing now, really, but there are clearly only a handful of really senior female leaders working within the men's professional game at the moment. We've talked a lot about the success in terms of the women's game. What else do you think needs to be done to drive perhaps more equality across all of football?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I was at a Women in Football event who've been a fantastic organisation in championing and supporting women in football and calling out challenges in the industry as women were coming through. I think certainly if you look at the FA, half the directors are female, half the board are female. If you said that to me a few years ago, I'd been like, really? Wow. I wouldn't have thought it was possible to change so quickly. There's been a real drive to get more women in key leadership positions. I think still from the research and insight that's sort of come out, there's more to be done around women in senior positions in clubs, but it is changing. We just talked about Annie going in as sporting director of Villa. There are a number of clubs who, of course, women don't just have to work in women's football, not at all. There are a number of women working across, or solely in men's professional football, or working across the game. But I think one opportunity is definitely the advancement of women's football in the clubs and senior positions that clubs are starting to employ to drive the women's game. But I think, it is changing. More women are coming through the football industry more because of that. I think women are seeing it as a good choice career-wise. I think women might have been put off before by what they think the culture might be of working in football and some of the stories coming out in previous times. I don't hear that anymore. I hear sort of, I'm not saying that the football industry is perfect at all, but I hear a lot of positive stories of women working in the industry, and I think you've got to say, well done to people like Women in Football who've challenged that.
And finally, after all your fantastic years of experience in sport, what advice would you give to young, aspiring female leaders perhaps coming in at the beginning of their career as you were coming out of university now?
To want to come in and work in the football industry?
Or just generally in sport?
Well, first of all, I would say if I do sort of talks to students, what a fantastic industry it is to work in. It's your passion. I've worked a lot of hours every week for a long, long time. My mum keeps telling me off again, when are you going to get a life?
And today as well.
Today, yeah. I've been on the phone since 6:30 a.m. And that's fine, because it never feels like a day's work, because you love it so much. And I always say to people that, with our team, the hardest thing is to stop them working, not encouraging them to work. It's trying to get balance. We talk a lot about balance and life and health and all of those things, because you can get sucked in because you're so passionate about it. But I think, it's a wonderful place to work, sport, absolutely. And of course, you've got, whether you're a lawyer in sport or you're a commercial director or you're a coach, there's just so many different facets of working in the sports industry as well. But yeah, I always encourage people, especially football, of course, because I'm biased, but football is a fantastic place to work, and it's now a fantastic place for women to work as well. And I think absolutely go for it. And then, all the other advice is all the sort of stuff you'd hear anyway, about building your networks and all of those things. But I just encourage them to go for it, really, and say what a fantastic and inspiring industry it is to work in.
Thanks again to Kelly for taking the time to meet with me and share so much of her incredible career in football. It'll be fascinating to see how the theWSL develops in the next couple of years, and we wish Kelly and her team well with all those commercial negotiations and broadcasting discussions. If you're enjoying the Game Changers, then please do tell your friends and family about the podcast. And if you could share details on social media and take a moment to review and rate the podcast wherever you listen, I'd be hugely grateful. Thanks again to Barclays for supporting this series of the Game Changers and helping us to spread the word about these incredible women in football. You can find out all about this season's guests at www.promotepr.com/gamechangers. And thanks also to my executive producer for this series, Sam Walker at What Goes On Media. Next week, I have the privilege of talking to Casey Stoney MBE, manager at Manchester United Women. Casey was capped over 100 times for England and captained the Lionesses and Team GB during the London 2012 Olympics.
Throughout my teenage years, I was actually bullied for playing football, because it was not really the thing to do for a girl. I would go home and cry a lot of the time. It's so hard as a girl to play sport because there's so many barriers. I played in the boys team. I had to go ready because there was no changing facilities, leave muddy because there was no changing facilities. You get teased by parents. There's so many reasons to quit.
The Game Changers. Fearless women in football.